Welcome to World Talks. My name is Adam Jasser. My guest is Professor Marc Lanteigne from the Arctic University of Norway. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
So, Professor, has the Cold War returned to the Arctic?
I say we are definitely seeing a variation of the Cold War return to the Arctic. Now the discussion these days is all about great powers and spheres of influence and fights over resources. So we're certainly seeing something similar.
But this time around, it's China and Russia versus, let's say, the Western Arctic powers, or is it an exaggeration?
Well, China and Russia are now very important Arctic players, but for different reasons. Russia likes to remind everybody that they are an Arctic state, which they are, whereby China is still a relative newcomer to the Arctic. They have no Arctic territory, but they consider themselves an Arctic stakeholder.
So we recently had that ship, the Istanbul Bridge,
Yes.
A container ship with Chinese goods traveling to Europe through the Northern Passage. How significant is this?
It's significant in that ever since, I'd say for the past decade now, China has been very interested in making use of the Arctic as an alternative shipping route. So it's been talking about making use of the Northern Sea route, the Northwest Passage, and eventually the Central Arctic. Things sort of went off the rails though, first because of COVID and then the geopolitical aftershocks of Russia's full invasion of Ukraine. But now China is very much back. It wants to restart the idea of the Arctic as a shipping route, and the Istanbul Bridge is seen as the first step to that return.
So what's going to happen next? Because obviously this is not necessarily a welcome step for some of the European Arctic countries, or perhaps they don't mind?
Well, it's a big question for the European Arctic because while on one hand China is insisting that it wants to make use of the Arctic for civilian traffic, the fact that Russia and China are cooperating more frequently in the Arctic, that there have been joint military maneuvers in the recent past, this is a concern in Europe. And the worry is that China will also start to get militarily involved in the Arctic in the near future.
So paradoxically, President Trump was right when he drew attention to the vulnerability in security terms and economic terms of the Arctic when he said, I want to annex Greenland.
Well, yes and no. Like the biggest issue that the current American government has in the Arctic is that this is a government that doesn't recognize climate change, which is still the number one security concern in the Arctic. You ask any Arctic government, they will say, well, obviously military security is important, but with climate change, it affects pretty much everything else. At the same time, there's still the question about what Russia is seeking in the Arctic versus China. China cannot claim any kind of territory or water in the Arctic, so it's restricted in that sense. Russia is still very nervous about maintaining its own views of Arctic sovereignty, and Russia and China, even though they cooperate, there's still the question of how much trust there is between the two powers.
Well, it seems there is a lot of cooperation, at least when it comes to Ukraine war and challenging the US supremacy. So why not in the Arctic?
The Arctic is a bit different. For starters, Russia considers the Arctic to be very important to it, not only in terms of strategy, but also due to its national psyche. Like Russia has considered itself an Arctic nation for centuries. And while Russia has been very happy to receive support from China and potentially from other countries, it still maintains the idea that we are the Arctic state, and therefore we should get priority when it comes to Arctic affairs. Now here's China. China is not an Arctic state, but it is in a position to provide support financially and logistically for Russia. But what will that mean for Russia's sovereignty in the region? So a lot of Russian government members are saying, okay, how much are we willing to give up in order to maintain this cooperation with China?
Right, so you're suggesting that it's still an open question, but in the past it seems that the West was caught off guard. Sort of using this kind of argument, we need to see this is not necessarily such close cooperation as we think, only to discover years later that it's actually quite close. So what is the risk of that?
Well, for starters, I don't think this was a question of anyone getting caught off guard because the Polar Silk Road was announced by Russia and China in 2017.
Right.
So what happened then was it was pretty obvious that China was going to be a major Russian partner to develop this particular Silk Road. That said, though, what China has been not able to do, it hasn't been able to have full access to the Arctic, even though there have been joint maneuvers. They've usually been in areas well outside of Russian military areas. And a lot of it has been primarily, as you say, to demonstrate to the West that, look, we are here, please don't try to push us out, and we are an alternative power in the far north.
Right. You mentioned climate change and the fact that for many Arctic governments this is still a top priority. Melting ice, the opening of the northern route, if I understand correctly, these are the main concerns. But these are also opportunities in a sense for the region because, maybe it's easier to explore for minerals, or the shipping traffic can go also the other way around.
Yeah.
And European companies can benefit. So why is climate change such a huge concern here?
It is a huge concern for a few reasons. First of all, its unpredictability, how it is going to affect the local environment and how that is going to affect the people living in the Arctic. How is this going to affect, for example, fishing? How is this going to affect pollution levels and changes in climate? How is this going to affect indigenous practices? These are all questions which have very, very suddenly appeared just in the space of the last few years, and we don't have some very clear answers to them. Then we have the concern about, okay, if we start to see more civilian traffic, more shipping, more boats starting to appear, will this accelerate the climate change damage?
We just spoke to Aya Chemnitz, the deputy from Greenland in the Danish parliament.
Yeah.
And she said, the lesson of the last several months since President Trump made that claim to Greenland is that we, even the local communities in the Arctic, we realize that sometimes short-term priorities need to take precedence over long-term priorities. So security over, let's say, climate change. Would you subscribe to that opinion?
I would agree up to a certain point. Obviously, when you talk about climate change, we are talking about a longer-term situation, although we are seeing some very short-term effects in terms of changes in temperature, fires, and changes in fishing activities. But yes, the argument can be made that now there's a very serious concern that the difficulties between NATO and Russia are starting to spill over into the Arctic, and that this is going to create a much more militarized situation in the region. So this is obviously a much more short-term concern.
So can you address climate change while simultaneously pursuing these short-term objectives, given that, for example, Russia and China aren't really that interested in European concerns about climate?
I think it's not a question of either or. I think that both climate change and hard power military security, not only are they both very important, but they work off of each other. Because if you have the acceleration of climate change, if we start to see more open water off the coast of Greenland in the central Arctic, this is going to accelerate activities which could have security implications. There's been all kinds of discussion here, for example, about dual use activities, so research with both civilian and military applications. That kind of activity will only accelerate. Now, China has put itself in a very interesting position. With the United States pulling back from its climate change commitments, China stepped forward and said, no, we are the country, we are the largest country that is a major driver of addressing climate change. So China's almost taken the wheel in that regard. And it has said, well, we want cooperation with Europe and with other countries to deal with Arctic climate change.
Mostly that cooperation is based on selling Europe Chinese green energy products, which in itself is a problem for European industry, isn't it?
It is, and China's also positioned itself, as you say, as a major provider of green technology. At the same time, though, China is pushing the idea of scientific diplomacy, which is a way of saying, okay, let's leave the politics out here in the hallway, let's just talk about the environment. But when it comes to China, it's simply not that easy.
Exactly. We had the same story when it came to globalization and free trade between China and the West. And now we see restrictions on rare earth exports to the West. So is there a risk that, again, there's too much focus on long-term strategy like climate and too little on making the region secure?
I would agree, and I think one issue right now, it's been understood that NATO now sees the Arctic as a priority, now that we have Sweden and Finland as full members. Well, that's all very well and good, but what is NATO's Arctic strategy? What is to be secured? What is to be defended? And we're not just talking about issues like military ship traffic. We're also dealing with issues like hybrid warfare, such as attacks on infrastructure, everything from cable cuts to drones to misinformation. So when we talk about security, what has happened now is the definition of Arctic security has widened quite a bit just in the past decade.
Have there been any instances of similar hybrid attacks as we've seen in the Baltic Sea here in the Arctic?
In Norway, there have been issues of cable cuts. We've had issues of espionage. We've had issues of hacking. And we've had concerns that there are forces designed to degrade trust in local officials to say that when we talk about Arctic security, it's like a false choice. So the whole idea of Arctic security has become much more nuanced and much more kind of pushed into the gray zone.
So are you saying NATO still hasn't developed a proper strategy for the Arctic?
We are seeing a lot of movement on NATO to really clarify what it wants in the Arctic, but to really say specifically, okay, what is NATO defending, there's still a bit of ambiguity, which I think needs to be addressed.
So if you were to give some recommendations, what do you think should be the 3 priorities for NATO in this region?
First of all, to make sure that the Arctic states, the Arctic NATO members, have the information, the ability, the capability to defend themselves, because the Arctic is starting to face spillover.
So hardware.
Well, both hardware and I think also information, intelligence and data. The second point, though, and I would very strongly recommend the understanding that this competition, this military competition that we're seeing in the Arctic is not strictly limited to military. There's a great deal of hybrid, there's a great deal of involvement of civilian elements, and that needs to be understood. If we're going to be seeing a NATO paper in the Arctic, that needs to be there. And third, related, there needs to be greater linkages between NATO policy and the people who live in the Arctic. That includes indigenous peoples, but that includes also people who have on-the-ground knowledge of the Arctic, knowing issues of climate change, knowing issues of development, and how to incorporate that into any kind of strategic area.
So Iceland, we're on Iceland. There is this Arctic conference here.
Yes.
Iceland has no army, and it has some NATO presence, but not really much. So just to give our viewers an example, do you believe that there should be a greater proper military presence, NATO or any other, here on Iceland?
Well, I think it's 2 separate issues here, because on one hand, Iceland has certainly accelerated its cooperation with NATO in terms of information sharing and being involved in joint activities. There's the question, though, if we're going to increase NATO's physical presence, either in Iceland or elsewhere in the Arctic, what would that seek to accomplish? Is it for monitoring? Is it for balance of power? Is it to make sure that there is a certain amount of military capability here? That question would need to be answered first before we start talking about bases and places.
But you, as an analyst, you probably have an answer or a suggestion. Which should it be? Is it more troops, more boots on the ground, more ships patrolling the sea, or these other elements you mentioned?
Well, I think probably the biggest issue in the short term right now is monitoring. Like the Arctic, because the Arctic is opening up and because there are large portions of the Arctic which are extremely difficult to keep an eye on, the ability to understand what is happening in terms of ship movements, in terms of military activity. Russia is starting to build more and more icebreakers. China has made it very clear that it wants more ships in the region. How do we make sure that all of this new sea traffic is being properly monitored, and that the military threat that they might create is being understood?
And from that perspective, the deal that Finland and the United States just signed about building icebreakers, is it an important step in the right direction? What does it signify to you?
It signifies, this has been an issue in American Arctic policy for a long time now.
Yeah,
because
nobody talked about it for
Well,
years.
nobody talked about it, but as the Arctic became more and more on the agenda in the United States, there was a concern. At the time, the U.S. only had 2 functional icebreakers capable of operating in the Arctic. It just acquired a 3rd. But you look at Russia with 40 plus, you look at China with 5 icebreakers and more to come. So the ability to provide a balance there is being seen as important. But we go back to the question, okay, more icebreakers, what are they doing? Are they monitoring? Are they researching? Are they doing a little bit of everything? What is going to be their eventual role?
So that's not defined, in your opinion?
It's not defined. I don't think it is defined. And I think especially American Arctic policy right now has been making major pendulum swings between military, climate change, now we're back to military, but we haven't seen too much in the way of coherent activity. And with the U.S. obviously a major Arctic player and a major player within NATO, I think this is something that needs to be addressed quickly.
Professor, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for watching World Talks, and stay on with us for more news and analysis.